sure I change the names so it should show up correctly. Let's go to live dashboard. All right, it looks like we're live. So, Kyle, thanks for coming on and being willing to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Yeah, I'm currently studying philosophy, getting my master's at Western Michigan University. Um, Besides that, I'm just kind of an all-around nerd, overworked and underpaid also. Play a lot of chess, read a lot of stuff. As far as my own personal history with faith and Christianity goes, I was raised in a pretty standard fundamentalist Christian home. As I entered into high school, I became unhappy with a lot of answers pertaining to things such as evolution, age of the earth. I began to ask a lot of questions about contradictions in scripture, stuff like that. Unfortunately, the people who were closest at hand didn't have a whole lot of compelling resources that I liked a whole lot. And so for a while, I just kind of walked away from the faith until later in high school, probably around my junior year, is when I found some different people who were able to give different, more compelling answers. And at that point, I was sufficiently persuaded that Christianity is true.
Okay, cool. You said you were sufficiently persuaded. What was it that persuaded you?
Uh, Mostly philosophical theistic arguments, and then also the cumulative historical case for Christianity.
Okay, cool. I'm an atheist, by which I mean I believe there are no reasons to believe in a God. I believe that naturalism and atheism offer us a more accurate prescriptive, more accurate description of reality and give us a better. Um, 1 second. This time my sound's a little quiet, so I'm going to bump it up a little bit.
Yeah, let me know how mine is as well.
They say you're good. It's always my mic that seems to have issues. I don't know why. But so I don't believe there's any reason to believe in a God. I believe that atheism, naturalism gives us a more accurate description of reality. So could you tell me what reasons you believe there are for belief in a God? And then I'd like to tell you my position on those reasons, and then I'd like to hear your thoughts on my position.
Yeah, so actually, you mentioned you said bring some evidence for believing in God or some evidence. I thought it might be interesting just to go over one particular argument that is Swinburne's cosmological and just get your thoughts on it. I'm still forming my own intuitions about it, at least some aspects of it. I'm not sure how familiar you are with it, but I don't know if you want me to just go on and kind of run it out a little bit, or if you already have thoughts ready to go on that matter.
Yeah, sure. You can definitely bring it out. I'm assuming it's
Sure.
probably like the other cosmological, where it's saying there's something outside of space and time that created the universe, and it's probably going to be a mind for some reason.
Yeah, I believe Swinburne does ultimately posit some agency to it, just as a matter of improving the explanatory power of it. So basically, his argument is going to run this way. We have a complex universe. It exists. That much seems true, unless we're just going to go a really weird skeptical route. Um, and from that, we can infer that God exists. There's obviously a lot to fill in there. Within that, there is first the idea that as we're trying to find some sort of explanation for things, first, we want as few brute facts as possible. We're ultimately going to need brute facts no matter what. Either we will just have to posit that the universe just exists in the way that it does, and it just happened to either come to exist, or it just so happened to always exist in the manner in which it does exist. Speaking broadly, obviously there's going to be some manner of physical change, but as far as the existence of matter and energy and the laws that govern them goes, those things have just always existed on one route, or they just did come to exist in just such and such a certain way. The alternative explanation is that there just is a God, and Swinburne posits that it is simpler to posit something that is omni in all these different guards. So, for example, omniscient, omnipotent, um, and any other qualities such as goodness. We'd say this God is maximally he maximally possesses that quality, or maximally is that quality, depending on what kind of theological jargon you want to adopt there. And so the idea is going to run this way. If all of the current scientific data that we have pertaining to the nature of the universe on a cosmological level holds out. It appears that the universe did come into existence at some point. We have all this expansion. You run that backwards far enough, you get everything popping out of some sort of singularity, which possessed traits and qualities that would be apparently impossible with our physical models. And so you'd either have to posit that there was some sort of exception operating at this time that enabled these apparently physically impossible things to be possible at that time. Or there was something else weird that happened. We run the story far back enough, all of the galaxies, all the stars, all matter and energy is collapsing inwards towards a singularity. But at some point, that's the first point, they just start popping outwards, whether they popped into existence first or whether they had just always existed. Or whether all matter and energy had just always existed in kind of that static point, and then it just started zooming upwards. Swinburne's hypothesis, or Swinburne's argument, is that God is a simpler explanation and therefore a better explanation for why that might have come to be the case, given all of everything we know inductively about the universe. And then just for the sake of argument, he also entertains the idea that even if we find further empirical data which contradicts the empirical data that we currently have, and it turns out the universe either isn't expanding or didn't appear to come into existence, the fact that it always has existed in such and such a particular way with such and such particular laws governing it, physical laws that is, it is better explained by the existence of a God, remaining static, kind of willing that those laws should remain the same, that the universe should continue to exist, rather than the universe just continuing to exist in a certain way and never exist any other way without any apparent explanation for why it never does exist in any other way. So what we really have here is basically two arguments. The first is the one that makes use of the empirical data that we have, the cosmological empirical data. I think that is certainly the stronger argument. I think that is a stronger argument that the existence of the universe, as it is, given everything we know about it, is more likely given God's existence than given the existence of no God, or given the existence of at least a God of some sort, than given the existence of no God whatsoever. Then the second argument is going to make much more use of Swinburne's intuitions about simplicity and the principle of sufficient reason that he's relying upon, that we do need to favor or lean towards the simpler explanation. I personally think the first argument that makes use of the empirical data is pretty strong. It's a pretty standard cosmological argument. It's almost resembling, which I'm sure you're familiar with, but it is slightly different. The second argument, I'm still forming my intuitions about. I'm on the fence about whether if I was an atheist, I would find that compelling. So I'm curious what arguments you might have against that, or for it if you wanted to put it in the strongest form first. That's about all I have to just rattle off on the subject. So unless you have any questions first, I'd love to hear your thoughts on those.
All right, sure. So first, I agree that the universe had a beginning at the Big Bang. Our universe had a beginning at the Big Bang for sure. But there are definitely other alternatives. That doesn't need to be an absolute beginning. There's no evidence that indicates that everything, all natural material stuff, began at the Big Bang. That's not a conclusion in any form of physics ever. So, I mean, there is already theories of things natural existing prior to the Big Bang, such as Nima Arkani Hamad's amplituhedron and Sean Carroll's emergent spacetime, and lots of other models. So, the Big Bang does not in any way indicate that there is a supernatural anything, or that there would require to be an ultimate creator of some kind or necessary solution to that. Like there could always just be another contingent solution after that. There's no reason. There's nothing that actually indicates a necessary stopping point prior to the Big Bang.
So you're moving pretty quick there. Can you lay out alternative models just a little bit more?
What?
Would you be able to lay out those alternative models?
No, I don't understand quantum mechanics at all. It's essentially, space and time are just things, just like atoms are things, and they're made of other things. And the things they're made of are called, like the amplituhedron is the particle essentially that Nima Arkani Hamad presents as what creates space-time, and Sean Carroll presents something else where he's saying space-time is emerging from some other fundamental natural thing. And so space-time is just composites of other things. And so it's just like an atom that's being broken apart to find smaller things that make it, essentially. And there's just like in science where we say something is like a philosophical concept like time, and then Einstein comes along and says, well, no, time can bend actually, so it's not actually a philosophical concept, it's a physical concept. Those in the universe, it can completely shift our intuitions about how these concepts work in reality. And so there's nothing about space and time, even though we consider them to be like absolute philosophical concepts, reality just doesn't care. Like they can, in reality, they could be just composites of physical things, and that would just be fine. So our presuppositions about how space and time work don't really apply to reality at all. Just like our presuppositions about how time is a philosophical concept and can't bend just don't apply to reality at all. So in physics, you're allowed to do really strange things like make space and time a composite, and there's no contradiction there. But what I was going to say next was that when Swinburne says we want to have as few brute facts as possible, that's not necessarily true, because if you have one brute fact with 10 properties, that is worse than having 10 brute facts, because then you have the 10 properties, which are each a layer of complexity, plus the additional fact that these are all comprised in one brute fact. So that's actually 11 things you have there. Whereas if you just have 10 brute facts, that's one less thing. So it's actually simpler to have more brute facts with less properties than it is to have one brute fact with many properties. And the problem with the God hypothesis is that when Swinburne says the omnis are simple, no, there's absolutely nothing simple about the omnis. Saying that there is an all-powerful being who has no limitations and you're simply defining simplicity as the lack of limitations is as bad as the atheists who like to just define their belief as a lack of belief kind of a thing, where you're not actually giving it the correct definition of simplicity, you're just inverting the definition to suit your own needs. So if you have an all-powerful being, the way to assess the simplicity of that is how many things can it create? And you just if you can create infinitely many apples, well, then it's infinitely not simple. So simply calling that simplicity because you want it to be, or saying that, oh, it's just simpler to say it's to assess it has no limitations, is just a backwards way to try to assess simplicity. It's not. There's nothing about that that's simple. And you can see this with just a simple analogy. If you say, if you have a perfectly simple being and an apple, is that simpler or more complicated than just having a perfectly simple being? Well, I mean, there's a problem here, because if there's an all-powerful being who can create infinitely many apples, and you compare that to an apple, and you say, well, the all-powerful being who can create infinitely many apples is simpler than the apple, there's clearly a problem here. That's like saying...
You're breaking up here just a little bit.
Okay, yeah, so the problem... did you follow mostly what I was saying there, that if you have an infinitely powerful being that can create infinitely many apples and claim that is simpler than an apple, you have a problem?
Right. So in apple, we live in some sort of cosmological state where there's just a singular apple, and for some reason we're there to observe it as well.
It's just a comparison of simplicity. So if you have two different objects and you're comparing which is simpler, and you have a God, an all-powerful being, and you have an apple, which is simpler, well, the apple is simpler.
Right. So there's going to be a difference between something like structural complexity and explanatory or structural simplicity or conceptual simplicity, as opposed to explanatory simplicity. Because if we do say that something which is finite and such characteristics exists, then there's suddenly an apparent need for a reason about why its finite limits are set where they are.
No, that's absolutely wrong. That's not in any way a requirement at all. So that's an inversion of simplicity. Simplicity is just, well, in any way you define simplicity, it's just like a composition of these two things. Like, what is it? What it makes it up? How do you define it? What are the properties it has, et cetera, et cetera. Saying that you need to apply limits is like saying, okay, I have an apple at point A, but it doesn't exist at point B or C or D or E or E or F. And then you're trying to say all those it's not here's are all entailed in the complexity of the thing, which is not. So no, there's absolutely nothing about it that entails an explanation of its limitations. You can just say this is what it is. And the fact that it is that thing means it's not all of the other things by definition. There's no additional assumption there required to explain its limitations. That's completely ad hoc. There's nothing required about that in simplicity at all. So it's, again, when you compare two objects, an all-powerful God who can create infinitely many apples and an apple, the apple is simpler. It wins no matter what. Infinitely is infinitely simpler than a God. Now, if you want to invert simplicity to say, well, we can use a God as a simpler explanation, no. That's not at all the case. The fact that you can have more pieces in this God thing to solve more problems does not make it a simpler explanation. It's like saying, I have a bridge or that can cross this gap. Well, I have infinitely many Lego pieces, so I can just cross any gap in there first, the simplest explanation. Like, no, it's not how it works. So every one of Swinburne's attempts to define God as the simplest possible being completely fail, like absolutely, objectively, is complete nonsense. Saying an all-powerful being who can create infinitely many universes is somehow simpler than a universe that just exists as a brute fact is obviously false. Just like saying an all-powerful being that can create infinitely many apples is somehow simpler than an apple. Like, no. And there's no requirement to place any limitations on it, because I can just say it's a brute fact. So just like my example before of saying one brute fact with 10 properties is more complicated than 10 brute facts. If you have one brute fact that's all powerful, that's one brute fact with infinitely many properties. It can create infinitely many apples, essentially. And that is far more complicated and ad hoc than just saying we have a universe that is this way because of a brute fact, or to just make the laws of physics a brute fact, because that's a finite number. So that finite number of brute facts, properties of the universe, is far simpler, infinitely simpler than saying there is one brute fact that is all powerful. That is definitely not simple at all in any way. I mean, and we can just intuitively think about it this way. If we have, which is simpler, a universe or an apple, or a God who can create infinitely many universes, I mean, obviously the universe is simpler. So simply trying to invert the definition and say, well, all powerful is simpler because it has less limitations is just obviously false.
So there's a lot more to say on explanatory simplicity. I still think you're conflating two things here, explanatory simplicity versus structural or conceptual simplicity. But let's take these in kind of the order that you brought them up. The first thing, if we kind of chunk these up into three things, it would be competing cosmological models, our distinction between physical concepts and philosophical concepts that you made that I thought was interesting, that I'd like to hear more about. And then there is the point you made about brute facts plus
properties.
Plus characteristics that we have to apply to the things that we're supposing to exist just by way of brute fact. And then we should really get back to explanatory simplicity versus structural. So
Well, actually, I'd like to start with that one really quick. So there is no such thing as explanatory simplicity. It's purely ad hoc. It doesn't work. So like if you just, again, it's if you say there is this thing called explanatory simplicity, the more stuff you have, the more, like if I'm trying to build a bridge and I have a certain number of pieces, the more pieces I have, the easier it's going to be to build a bridge. But that doesn't mean that the more pieces I have is simpler. That is false. That's not how it works. So saying that you have an ability to explain something easier because you have more pieces does not make those more pieces easier. It's purely ad hoc to define simplicity that way.
That's an interesting application of the idea of ad hocness. I'm not sure I'm tracking how that works.
Well, you can just
as far as structural simplicity, as far as explanatory simplicity goes, here's an analogy. We look at a clock. We ask ourselves, how does the clock operate? You give an explanation where it has 5 cogs and gears, and these plus a battery allow it to work, plus whatever electrical hardware it would need, or whatever hardware it needs. And then I posit that there are tiny little gnomes living inside of it that are turning things around, and they just so happen to have a metaphysical connection to the time that should be correct, and so they're just turning it around the whole time. The problem is these gnomes themselves need an existence of what they are, why they exist, why we should think they exist. We have no independent reasons to think that they exist. We have good reasons to think of why cogs and gears and batteries should exist. So your explanation in that case is much simpler. You have to posit fewer things. If you're relying on the cogs and gears hypothesis, I have to posit a lot more things if I'm positing the existence of gnomes and whatever species that is, and there are all kinds of problems which get raised there. And so explanatory simplicity is absolutely a thing. And so when we apply that to something such as the universe itself,
how does that compare to explanatory simplicity? Which part of that is explanatory simplicity?
If you're positing cogs and gears and batteries, whatever, you're positing fewer things that we have no explanation for. It doesn't matter, even if if I can get off saying that we can explain this with one gnome, and you say, well, I would need about 10 cogs and gears to make it operate on this hypothesis. Uh, it doesn't necessarily matter that mine has fewer numbers in it, that my explanation has fewer numbers. That doesn't necessarily make it more explanatorily simple. The fact that there are fewer things that you are positing for which we lack independent evidence for, you're positing fewer things that would have to exist as just a kind of brute fact without any sort of other reason to think they exist, without anything unexplained about them. That is explanatory simplicity.
Well, okay, so there's a few things there. One is that if you're asserting things we have no evidence for, well, then that's just immediately invalidates that as a plausible explanation at all. But the point that you made about simplicity, where it's like the brute facts thing, the brute facts thing is just irrelevant. It makes no difference. The whether or not you have a brute fact doesn't change anything. Like we essentially in science, there is no such thing as a brute fact. It's just we don't have those. We just have things that we have yet to explain. There are no brute facts, essentially. And so asserting a brute fact doesn't add or take away to the simplicity. It's just one of those things that we have no evidence for. It's just like saying a leprechaun. There's a brute fact. Well, no, that's a leprechaun. It doesn't exist in science. So when you're making claims about how many brute facts there are, it's just irrelevant to the argument. That's just saying how many leprechauns do you have. That doesn't help. That does nothing to the explanation.
So let's approach this another way. We both draw up a diagram for why this clock works. We're looking at the clock on the wall. We have no idea why it works or how it works. You give a diagram that only requires 5 cogs and gears. I give you a diagram that requires 200. We have no other reason to think that there are cogs and gears of any particular shape and size within that clock. It is far more likely that your explanation is right, trying to posit the minimal explanatory factors necessary. You have a simpler hypothesis in that regard. You are much more likely to be right than I am positing 200 cogs and gears of particular shape and size functioning together in a certain way. You have a simpler explanation in that way, not just because it requires fewer pieces, but because it requires fewer things that we just kind of have to guess into the void about the nature of.
Okay, so yeah, if I have a simpler explanation of how the clock works, that is definitely like Occam's razor.
You have explanatory simplicity in that regard.
Right, but that's still just mechanical simplicity. That has nothing, explanatory simplicity is just not a thing there. We can just say there are less pieces here. We're done.
Okay. So let's go at it a different way.
I mean, it's always going to come back to the same thing. Explanatory simplicity is garbage. It's nothing. It's ad hoc. And if you don't like my use of the
term ad hoc, you have to explain why.
What?
Yeah, so could you explain what exactly you understand ad hoc to be and why that would be ad hoc?
You don't need to, like, going into that is a complete waste of time. You can just consider it to be stupid. It's a derogatory sense. It's made up for the purposes of fitting your hypothesis. Like the point of all of when Plantinga and other people put in this explanatory simplicity and omnipotent, or the lack of limitations is the most simple. It's ad hoc. They're just adding in crap to make their explanation work. It's completely false. It's like saying that I have more pieces, which is simpler than your less pieces. No, it's not. It's the exact opposite of simplicity in every conceivable intuitive way ever. It's totally ad hoc. It's just an addition to a hypothesis to make it fit because it's inconsistent with the data.
The number of pieces doesn't necessarily matter. It's possible that a hypothesis with fewer pieces could be a simpler, more elegant explanation than an explanation that posits an additional piece to make it make sense, but that's not necessarily the case.
Right, like the 20 gears could be the way the clock works. The 5 gears could just be wrong. It's totally fine with that. The problem is that when you call the simpler one more plausible or more likely, and then you say the simpler one is the one that has 20 pieces, you're just wrong. Like, no, it's not. That's just making up a new definition of simplicity to fit your hypothesis.
Right. So here's why it would be the case that it would make more sense in this case to posit 20 gears instead of 5 gears. I know something, this is where analogies are imperfect. I know something about the clock that shows why your 5 gears are in all likelihood inadequate. There's just something about it, whatever it is, we have no clue.
Right.
In this case, the idea is we know enough things about the universe to know that things don't either pop into existence out of nothing or just rapidly expand without reason, completely uncaused. And if this is all time, matter, or if this is all matter and energy, kind of wrapped up into a singularity, it randomly explodes out of nothingness or out of the singularity, then we would like some sort of explanation for that. So you can posit as a brute fact, it just did happen. That's what a brute is.
No explanation.
That would be an
It's just a
unexplained
fact that
fact.
has no explanation.
What was that?
It's a fact that has no explanation. It's just a brute fact. That's what brute fact means. Just no further explanation.
Yes. So it just did happen. Or you can say there's a God who caused it to happen in such and such a way. Now, the problem is the very nature of physical things doesn't seem to give us any kind of plausible model whereby this could actually happen if there wasn't something besides besides matter and energy to make it happen. And I want to get back. This is why I wanted to go back and kind of address what you said in order. You said there are models of the Big Bang where it wasn't matter and energy coming into existence, but that
space
kind
and
of
time. But I wanted to pick up on what you just said for a minute there. So we
Sure.
know of nothing that is material that is a necessary thing or a brute fact. We don't have any basis in physics that gives us a ground for that. We also don't have a basis in God that gives us a ground for that. It's just
Wait,
an
say
assertion.
that one more time.
So you're right that there's nothing in matter or physics that gives us a ground for a necessary thing or a brute fact. Physics does not give us one of those things. There's no material thing that we could say, oh, well, here's a brute fact. Or
Yeah, so
here's
you're misunderstanding my point a little
no,
bit.
no,
Here.
no. So I'm understanding it. The problem is that when you say the material world does not give us a sufficient reason to say that this could just be the ultimate cause, essentially. You're using the clock analogy, you're saying that the physical things is like the 5 gears, but that 5 gears doesn't work because it doesn't give us a way to explain why things are the way they are. You're just saying, so,
That's not what I'm saying.
okay, what are you saying?
There are positive reasons to think that matter and energy could not have caused matter and energy to pop into existence, causing itself.
Okay, right, but that's no one says that. Literally, no one says that. So the
Yeah, so I'm curious.
no, the
I'm
competing
very
arguments.
curious what models you're trotting out
The
then.
competing
This
arguments
is where the
are
models actually
the
matter.
competing arguments are either nature is the necessary thing or God is the necessary thing. There's always going to be a necessary thing, and there's always going to be a brute fact. Either God's nature is the way it is because of no reasons, or nature's nature is the way it is for no reasons. And the competing hypothesis is either there's this all-powerful being who can create infinitely many universes, who has this nature, which is a brute fact, which is just infinitely many properties right there in this one brute fact, or nature's nature is the way it is, and that's a brute
That's
fact.
not infinitely many properties. That's just a false statement.
Being
We posit
able,
certain
if
properties
you
of God.
have,
These include power,
no,
knowledge,
no, no,
goodness.
those are not properties. Those are ad hoc nonsense. So if you have a being who is all
What on earth are you
powerful,
even talking about now? Tom, that makes
no, no,
no
no, no,
sense.
no,
Why?
no, no. Again, if you have a being who is all powerful, who can create infinitely many universes, that is equivalent to having infinitely many properties. You can't just like call that a property and be done. Like, no, that's crap. So if you
Predicating a
have,
property of a thing to if I'm a factory worker and I make however number many widgets in this factory, that doesn't mean I have 37 properties about me because I made 37 widgets that day.
right, but
I
that's
have certain properties such as intelligence, dexterity, whatever,
right. No,
and
no, no, no.
those properties
In the
allow me to
factory,
produce these widgets.
in the factory, you create the things from other things. You're not creating them ex nihilo. If you can create them ex nihilo, everything you can create is one of your properties. So it's magic. So everything God can create ex nihilo is added to the complexity of God. It's like you're just saying there's this magic poof property that can just poof things into existence. Everything that property can poof into existence is added to the complexity of that property. So saying there is a God who is all powerful, who can poof anything they want into existence ex nihilo, is infinitely complex. There is no way that is ever going to be a simple single property thing. No. So if you compare this, like my original analogy, a God who can create infinitely many apples ex nihilo versus an apple, and just say this God's property is a brute fact, or saying this apple's property is a brute fact, the apple is simpler. It doesn't
So
matter.
you're misunderstanding the conception of creation. Your God is not reaching into himself and pulling and extracting things out of it, like as if he was mining certain things
No,
to
no,
put
no.
into
Ex
spatial temporal
nihilo means
reality.
from nothing.
The fact that he creates warm and fuzzy pandas does not mean there's anything warm and fuzzy and panda-ish about God.
Right. I never said that. So I said in a factory, you create things from other things, which means those other things are not properties of the factory because you're getting the material for those things from somewhere else. In God's case, he's creating them ex nihilo, from nothing. He's not like taking fuzzy pandas from himself. He's just thinking them into existence, essentially. And so everything he can think into existence adds to the complexity of him. It's not because it's in him somewhere, but everything he can potentially create, everything he can use this property of poofing into existence to create, adds to the complexity of that property. I'm not saying that
he's
it's
capable of thinking of or of conceiving of is an additional property.
what?
So he can think of something.
If you can poof it into existence, yes. If you can just think of it, that's fine. Like there's no problem in saying you can think of something. That doesn't necessarily add to your complexity. But if you have this poof into existence property, and you can all of the different things you can poof into existence is added to the complexity of that property.
And why is that the case exactly?
Because it's ex nihilo. You're not like using other things which already exist, which have their own level of complexity to build these things. You're poofing them into existence.
God poofs a warm and fuzzy panda into existence, and now God has a property of warm and fuzziness?
No. Again, it's just whatever that can do, the property of poof into existence, the power of that property is kind of like the power of a battery. However much that battery can charge is the level of complexity of that battery. So if we
call that omnipotence in God's case.
Right. So there's infinitely much power there, which means every one of the things it can charge essentially adds to like how we assess the complexity of that property. So if we have a battery and it can charge one TV and then it dies, well, then that battery only has as much complexity as to power that one TV. If it can power two TVs, well, that battery is more complicated. It's got more energy to it. And if it can power three TVs, well, that's an even more complicated battery. It can power three TVs. If it can power infinitely many TVs, that battery is not simple. That is the least simple battery possible because it has infinitely much energy to it. So if you have this property of poof stuff into existence, and it can only poof one thing into existence, that is a much simpler property than the property that can poof infinitely many things into existence.
Yeah, so this is where we need to get to some of your critiques of Swinburne's notions of simplicity and divine simplicity. You said the fact that there are limits doesn't make something more complex. I'm still not seeing the clarity. I'm not clearly seeing why your intuition works there. So the idea here is going to be that if God could create such and such pandas, but could not create pandas of a different sort, there would be some sort of limiting factor there. There would be some sort of difference in kind in the pandas that was reflected in some sort of limitation present in God's potency, his ability to create things or ability to do things.
Well, could you
it would be simpler to say that he just has straight up potency than to say that he has potency plus certain limitations that keep him from being able to do certain things.
Well, again, could you use like a actual example in the world? Because again, all of those properties that are God's properties are not things that I think they're all nonsense. So using God's properties to try and explain more of God's properties is circular. Could you use a worldly example?
That's not circular. We're positing. So here's the problem.
No. I mean,
let's hear me out. This is something that he says, well, it'd be very strange to have a disembodied soul. We have no experience of disembodied souls. There's nothing analogous to this in our experience. But there's a really important distinction we need to make here between something being contrary to our experience and something that is contradictory to our experience. It would be contrary to our experience to find a disembodied soul. It would be contrary to our experience to find something that has the power or ability to create something ex nihilo, thing that is capable of bringing things into existence out of nothing. It is contradictory to our experience, and this is an important point in the cosmological argument. It is contradictory to our experience for matter and energy to pop into existence out of nothing. It is contradictory for it to be able to condense downwards into an infinitely dense, but also spaceless singularity. All of these things actively contradict our experience of the physical world and what it's capable of.
Well, there's a couple things there. One is that no, it doesn't. Again, we can say time bending would be contradictory to our experience. Reality does not care what's contradictory to our experience. But I wanted to go back to your point where you were trying to explain.
So no. Let's touch on that just a little bit more. Time bending is not necessarily something that's contradictory to our experience.
That was literally the main criticism of Einstein's argument, is that time is a philosophical concept that can't bend, just like it's it's a category error, like saying the square root of a pork chop. That was the main argument against Einstein's thing, is that it, as a philosophical concept, it can't actually bend.
Look, that's
Then
fine, but there are other philosophical concepts of time where it can bend, and we wouldn't even realize it. It wouldn't be contradictory to our experience, because if it's bending, we're not even going to know it.
right, so the singularity where everything can collapse into an infinitely small space is actually physically possible. It is also not contradictory to our experience
That's physically how is that? So can you explain a little bit more how that's physically possible?
because of the same way time bending, literally the exact same physics that allows time to bend allows singularities to happen.
So time bending isn't all that crazy of a concept. You watch 15 minutes worth of YouTube videos and you'll have a decent grasp on it. I have yet to find a 15-minute YouTube video or any source of information that allows me to get a good grasp on
There,
how we could get a singularity that is a viable metaphysical possibility.
it's literally the same physics. So anything that allows time to bend is the same exact thing that allows a singularity to happen. But I wanted to go back to your point where you were trying to explain why the limitations thing is a viable model and why my intuition about it doesn't work. Can you explain why having limitations is makes it less simple using an example of something here on the in the world as opposed to God's properties?
So say that one more time.
So you said the argument Swinburne or Plantinga's argument is that having limitations makes something more complicated. It's less simple to have
Are you
limitations
invoking Plantinga's argument? 'Cause I'm not familiar with it. I'm referencing Swinburne.
than Swinburne's one. Either one doesn't make a difference. So they're arguing that adding limitations adds complexity. So God could create a panda, but if he couldn't create some other panda, he has some limitation, and that's requires more explanatory something to explain it, and so it's less simple. Now try to do that with something here on Earth, not God's properties.
Right. So we have a battery. It has power. We find it's capable of powering one TV, two TVs, three TVs, not four TVs. Well, why is that the case? Because it possesses just a such and such amount of energy. It's only so big. It only has so much capacity. It can only put out so much output. If we had a battery that didn't have any of those limitations and was just an infinite sort of power, like the Tesseract out of the Avengers, I'm not sure. I hope you're familiar with that analogy. Uh, in that case, we wouldn't really need an explanation for why it lacked the power to power only a certain amount of things. In that case, the fact that there is nothing to posit about why it can only power a finite amount of things adds some layer of complexity to a battery, which the Tesseract does not have. Now, the Tesseract does invite its own set of questions about how and why it's able to power an infinite number of things, especially being a physical object. This is all happening in the Avengers universe, which has questionable physical laws anyways, so we don't need to explore that analogy too far. But in the case where a battery has a finite amount of power and can only power a finite number of TVs, it has some sort of characteristic or property or something about its existence that allows it to only power so many. The reason for that should be explained. In this case, the makers of Duracell or whatever thought this was the best fit for the market, and this is the best that they were able to put out to keep up with consumer demand and their competitors. And so that's why this battery has this much power and energy, and not another amount. If we were to say that God has a finite amount of power or potency, ability to create, ability to do things, then we would have to posit some sort of limitation without a reason. It just is the case that he's not able to do this. Now, we do this with the laws of logic. That's fine. We can have some intuitive reason for why that should be the case. But if we're going to say that God is very, very powerful but not omnipotent, well, then we have a weird story that we're going to have to tell about why he's not omnipotent at all.
Okay, so which is simpler, the Tesseract or the battery?
So let's do it this way. If I find out that the Red Skull, whatever his name is, has put together a time travel thing, or some sort of portal, whatever thing. If it is if I have two hypotheses, one is he took every Duracell battery on the face of the earth and used that to power it, or he took this thing, the Tesseract, which we don't fully understand, but we have some reason to think that if it did exist, it would be able to accomplish this task. If the Red Skull was actually real and doing this sort of thing, we should give some attention to the Tesseract hypothesis, because I'm not sure enough Duracell batteries could open up a portal or a time travel loop, whatever. That's trying.
How is that different from the leprechauns? So you have like your analogy with the clocks. I just think there's a whole bunch of leprechauns in there, and if they exist, they're powerful enough to make the clock move. Saying that
Mhm.
there's this new thing that we have no basis for, no evidence for, like the Tesseract, which we haven't seen at this point, and is using this magical thing to power it, is obviously going to be a terrible explanation. Like anyone who says that is just go
If we're
away.
if we're already in the Avengers universe where we're doing things like we're opening up portals to other dimensions and dealing with Thor coming down and bringing lightning down onto the face of the earth, the Tesseract becomes a much more viable
No,
hypothesis.
no, it
We're
doesn't.
getting too
But no,
far.
no, no.
We're getting too far
We
in
can,
this
the
analogy.
analogy doesn't make a difference here. So the problem is we have some phenomenon we can't explain, like portals opening, doesn't make a difference. And we want to say, well, how is this occurring? We have one option, which is there is an energy source that we know of called batteries. Maybe they're using batteries. And we have another option. There is a new magical energy source we know nothing about and have no evidence for. We always prefer the one we have evidence for, the batteries. That's always the simpler one. Doesn't matter how many, a finite number of batteries, 10 billion batteries. He's using 10 billion batteries is a better explanation than saying he's using one infinitely powerful tesseract that we have no evidence for. It's exactly like your analogy with the
So
leprechaun.
I'm not gonna want to say we have no evidence in the Marvel universe. We're gonna have some evidence for the existence of the Tesseract. Uh, let's go back to the leprechauns. The reason the leprechauns are a worse explanation is because suddenly we have all kinds of other things to explain. If these are leprechauns that are made up of matter and energy and they're organisms like the rest of us, how is it that they never have to go to the bathroom in there? How do they find food and sustenance in there? You have to posit all of these other explanatory things to make your explanation work. Um,
None of those matter.
why
The things we have to explain don't matter at all. Those are irrelevant. All that matters is can it do the work? We can just say
if we're trying to find the best explanation here, those things absolutely do matter, and that's
no.
to which you're
I
missing
can
out
just
on.
say those are brute facts. I can just call them all brute facts and be done. Like you
So
can
it's
do
just
that with anything. You can just
so
say,
it's just a brute fact that these leprechauns don't
yep,
need sustenance. It's a brute fact that they
yep,
don't need to use the restroom.
yep. I can just
And so
take
you're
all of their
positing,
properties and say brute facts, done. Like you can do this with anything. So this is why science doesn't use brute facts ever. All brute facts are essentially just leprechauns in themselves. It's appealing. It's solving a mystery with a greater mystery, essentially. So
science uses brute facts all the time.
no,
You literally have to use them to get a naturalistic explanation off the
no,
ground.
no, you
This
don't
thing
at
just
all.
did happen without any further explanation.
No, yeah, no, there are no brute facts in science. Science doesn't use brute facts at all. It uses logic, which we just assume is a brute fact. We don't care if it is or not. Nothing in science is a brute fact. Everything in science could have a further explanation. There is no stopping point in science. So brute facts are just an assertion made up for these kind of ontological, metaphysical solutions to the answers of everything, which science doesn't do. Science is not in the business of making answers for everything, but anyone can do it. So the what you're missing, I think, is that when you're trying to compare explanations of the universe or whatever, the solution is going to be a brute fact of some way. The competing hypotheses are naturalistic brute fact versus supernatural brute fact. And it's always going to be simpler to simply say that whatever natural stuff we have is the brute facts. And it's always going to be simpler than saying there is an infinitely powerful something we don't know about, which I don't consider we have evidence for an all-powerful anything. So, in calling that a brute fact is infinitely more complicated than
Yeah,
just saying
I lost the last 10 seconds of what you said.
what.
I lost the last 10 seconds of what you said. Sorry about that.
Okay, yeah, sure, no problem. So, when we're talking about explanations of the universe, the two alternative hypotheses are both brute facts. You're always going to end up with a brute fact. It's never matter
Gosh,
from
we're
nothing.
breaking up again.
So
The internet's conspiring for me to not hear this point.
so the universe went two competing hypotheses for the universe, the origin of the universe.
Yeah.
One of them is not matter popped into existence from nothing. That is not one of the alternatives. One of the alternatives is matter exists as a brute fact. That's a possibility, and it has some particular nature. One of the alternatives is there is a God who exists as a brute fact, and it has a particular nature. And
All
we're
right, so we're
comparing.
going to need to go back and talk about these cosmological models
Well,
someday.
objection there. So the cosmological models say nothing about brute facts. There are no brute facts in any cosmological model of
No,
physics.
as far as matter popping into existence, matter and energy popping into existence, whether it's Wikipedia or physics textbooks that I'm reading, all of them say that matter and energy began to exist with the Big Bang.
Right. None of them say from nothing. The from nothing part is the problem. They never ever
And
say
so,
from nothing.
what exactly was there before the Big Bang?
There's lots of possibilities there. That's the point. The amplituhedron, the emergent spacetime. There's nothing in science ever says there was nothing before the Big Bang.
Right, and so
No model ever
we're
says that.
positing these things that exist, and so this is where it's interesting. This is where we can start comparing your explanatory hypothesis to my explanatory hypothesis. So you need to posit what was it you said?
The amplituhedron or emergent spacetime.
Yeah, and so what mechanism do we have that allows us to think these things might exist and be able to cause this thing to occur?
Well, it's different combinations of the physics, the principles, particles, and physics that we have verified, and so they've combined them in different ways to create different possible models. But there's an easier way to approach this, which is those are all combinations of physics, so they're automatically better than anything you add that isn't a combination of physics. So all of those models, and none of them.
Right, unicorns pooping out universes is a combination of physics. That doesn't necessarily make it a better
No, no,
explanation.
no, no. I mean, in the physics models are only using combinations of principles, particles, and laws that have been verified in physics, and they just put them in different combinations of ways to explain reality. And in quantum mechanics, you can get things outside of space and time, which is how you get the amplituhedron and emergent spacetime, because there are things that can exist outside of space and time to create space and time. But the problem here is that none of those are a stopping point. They don't assert any brute facts. All of those things, the amplituhedron and emergent spacetime, could be made of other things. Nowhere in science do they ever assert a brute fact or a stopping point or we're done, here's the explanation of everything. They don't do that. That isn't the thing that physics does. We have to add that to physics. That's a made up unicorn or leprechaun or whatever. So when you take this God that's all powerful and add him to the physics, that's necessarily going to be a worse explanation every time, no matter what. In physics, the only applicable explanations are combinations of physics. And if you can't get a God from combinations of principles, particles, and laws in physics, you're making stuff up in physics. You're not allowed to do that. But if you want to allow that, the atheist can do the same thing and start adding in made up properties like brute facts. And we can just say, okay, all of these are just brute facts and we're done. And that's going to be a simpler explanation every single time than claiming there is this God that's all powerful and he's the brute fact.
So there's a more fundamental difference here. What you're basically saying is we can never arrive at an explanation of why things exist, and we
Whoa.
shouldn't even try to arrive at an explanation of why things exist.
Whoa, I never said that. I said physics doesn't do that. Like it doesn't try to. I don't say it's impossible. It could definitely be possible to discover that, but nothing in physics. We don't have anything in physics that could indicate that. There's no evidence of an ultimate beginning
That's
thing.
fine. That's why I'm appealing to God, which isn't something we study in theology, not physics.
Right.
So what exactly is it you think that allows us to have an explanation for the existence of a complex universe?
Anybody can make shit up. So just like if you want to appeal to this non-physical thing that you're adding to the physics, which is a God, the naturalist can do the same thing and make shit up. We can just make up brute facts. We could make up naturalistic laws that are
So
necessary.
you don't think we can have an explanation?
No, I know for a fact we do not have any basis in science for an ultimate explanation. It does not exist. But anybody can make stuff up. We can make up philosophical arguments for these things. That's totally fine. But none of them are actually evidence. We don't use philosophical arguments as evidence of existing things in physics. So just like a theist can claim there is this all-powerful God brute fact, any naturalist can just add on a natural brute fact. They can just do it. Okay, we're done. And the explanation is over. And we have an equally good or better explanation of the origin of everything. Scientists don't do this because it's a terrible methodology that gives us nothing. But we can. Anybody can.
Right,
Anybody.
so I'm going to interrupt you. Scientists don't do this because they're trying to answer a different set of questions, not because it's just a bunch of bullshit that doesn't get us anywhere. Scientists do, however, posit some brute facts, i.e., dark matter, dark energy, things that we
those aren't brute facts. No one claims those are brute facts.
things that we just have to posit. We have no clue what they are, how they metaphysically exist, or what they really do.
But
We
that's
just
not the
posit them
same as a
because
brute
they
fact.
make our models work. We have no clue what gravity actually
brute.
is or how it works.
Yes,
We
yes,
have-
I
we
agree
have-
with you.
we
I
have
agree
no
with
earthly
you.
clue, but we posit the existence of gravity, and we posit its
None
behavior in
of
certain
No,
as
none of
brute
those are
facts,
brute facts.
as far as the
Stop,
interest
stop,
of our
stop, stop, stop.
equations
I
goes,
gotta interrupt
because
you.
it makes it work. Stop interrupting
You
me.
said you
Stop,
said the
stop,
dark
stop,
matter. No,
stop,
no,
stop, Tom,
no.
stop,
I'm gonna mute you.
stop,
You realize this is my
stop.
server. I'm going to mute you.
Fine, then I'll
You
leave.
said dark matter and dark energy are brute facts.
Tom, you're making
No.
absurd claims here.
What? You said dark matter and dark energy are brute facts. They're not.
We posit them for the existence of
Right.
explanations as brute facts. We don't know how
No,
these things
no.
came to exist. We don't know how they work.
I don't understand what you're saying here. Dark matter and dark energy are just things of matter. They're not brute facts. We're not saying they just exist with no explanation. We
Right,
just
but
don't have one yet.
we have no clue. We posit them as antimatter. We don't actually know what that looks like or what it or
Right.
how it actually works, how it actually exists. We posit them as hypotheses. We
Right.
posit their existence as a brute fact that we really don't have any further explanation for yet. We hope for a further explanation down the road. But the ultimate point here is that as far as the cosmological argument goes, there is only so far down the road we can kick this can. Either we have to resort to a sort of skepticism, or we have to say we can have an explanation, and the best explanation is the existence of God, because otherwise we're left with the various mechanisms that you posited, and we have further explanations for those, and further explanations for those, and further explanations for those, and we never get at the ground level of things. And if you're happy with that, if you're satisfied with that, then fine. But very many of us are not satisfied with that, and so we want the best possible explanation of why this clock on the wall exists. And we have different ways of parsing out which explanations are better than others. If you don't want to participate in that conversation, then fine.
No.
But you can't simply look at it and say it's a bunch of arbitrary bullshit, because it's simply not. You should actually read the philosophical literature.
I have read the philosophical literature. Here's the problem. The first thing is that dark matter and dark energy are not brute facts. A brute fact isn't something we don't have an explanation for. A brute fact is something that by definition has no explanation. No one in science ever says anything is a brute fact. It's not a thing.
Brute facts are epistemic objects. As far as we know, we have no further explanation for them.
That's not a brute fact. A brute fact is something that by definition has no explanation.
In some cases, that might be the case.
A brute fact is something that by definition has no explanation. It's not something we don't know the explanation for. It's not epistemic. It's ontological. It's saying that this thing exists and has no explanation ever. Not that we just don't know about.
Brute facts in that sense, and sometimes we use brute facts just in an epistemic sense to say this is something I'm positing without any further explanation, because I don't know of any further explanations beyond that, but my set of brute facts is more elegant or a better set of explanations than your set of brute facts.
Okay, so I only ever use brute facts in the ontological sense. There is no epistemic brute fact, because that's like saying lightning exists, we can't explain it 2,000 years ago.
That's the
therefore
only way
lightning's
you're,
brute fact.
you're using brute facts, then you're using that brute facts incorrectly.
I'm
That's
just
the
going to say
problem.
you're using it incorrectly. It just obviously, because we don't use brute facts in science. We can use like what is it? Axioms and presuppositions. They're not brute facts though. That's not a brute fact in philosophy. Is only something which by definition has no grounding, no explanation. That's it. There is no epistemic brute fact. It's not a thing. But if you want to use it that way, that's fine. But when I'm saying brute facts, I only mean something which by definition has no explanation. The ultimate grounds of reality is going to be a brute fact in that way, in an ontological brute fact. Science does not ever, under any circumstances, use ontological brute facts. Not a thing. So dark matter and dark energy have nothing to do with brute facts. They're just things we don't know the explanation for.
And we at least agree they use epistemic brute facts all the time.
Sure, we use presuppositions all the time. We just assume that's what a hypothesis is. We assume my explanation is correct, make a prediction, and then test it. So yes, all science is just assuming presuppositions are true.
The question is, which set of brute facts is most likely to pan out?
Well, no.
As far as we know, epistemically, there's only so many things we know. There's only so many things we can come to know about the origin of the universe. And the claim is that in our current knowledge, in our current scientific data, God is a better, as far as we know, epistemically, he's a better explanation.
No, that's the problem, is you're conflating the epistemic brute facts and the ontological brute facts. The ontological brute facts are necessarily worse explanations than the epistemic brute facts. Saying we don't know is fine. We can say that for anything. What caused the universe? We don't know. Epistemic brute fact. Totally fine. Saying what caused the universe? A God. And what caused the God? Well, he's just a necessary ontological brute fact. That's a crap explanation. Because we can apply that same explanation to just say, nope, the universe is an ontological brute fact. It just has no explanation ontologically. It just is. That's just the necessary nature of reality. And that kind of brute fact can just be applied to anything. So
that's also an ontological brute facts are just crap, then that would be just a really crappy explanation. So you have a problem there. We're going to have to
No. I agree. So ontological brute facts are crappy explanations. That's right. That's why science never, ever uses them. They're all crap. So when you say there is a God who has an ontological necessary nature, and that is a brute fact, his nature is a brute fact, that's a crap explanation too. And the reason we know it's a crap explanation is because anybody can just take that this is an ontological brute fact and apply it to anything. So the reason the theist explanation is bad is because you're taking the epistemic brute fact, as you call it, of the universe, applying an ontological brute fact and just saying this ontological brute fact explains the universe. Anyone can do that. We can do that, and as a naturalist, as a scientist, we can just say, okay, we're going to make up an ontological brute fact, which is the fine-tuning constants. We're going to say these are all just ontological brute facts. And we now have a better explanation than the theistic one, a simpler explanation than the theistic one. Anyone who wants to apply ontological brute facts, you can do that for anything and everything. The reason scientists don't do it is because it's completely just ad hoc nonsense. It's asserted with nothing. Anyone can do that for any hypothesis.
Yeah. This sort of thing that scientists are trying to do, and finding why physical things interact with other physical things in such and such a way. There's a reason we don't posit just ontological brute facts about that. There's a reason we don't say in Aristotelian fashion that rocks just have a kind of thing that makes them inclined to fall towards the center of the universe, right? There's a reason we no longer do that. We found a better methodology.
It's because it didn't
But
work.
ultimately, if we're going to be naturalists, we're going to say, as a matter of ontological brute fact, the universe does just exist in such and such a fashion, and we have no further explanation for that. There is no further explanation for that. We can find explanations for things within the universe in terms of other things within the universe, but eventually we will need to take the universe as a whole and say it exists in this particular state as an ontological brute fact.
Right.
And so let's go back to Swinburne's two arguments here.
Wait. How is that different from theism? Because theism, instead of just saying the universe, say reality. Reality exists in a particular way as a brute fact. Yes, naturalists, we're going to say that. And
Yes,
as a theist, you're also going to say that.
So the point here is that you're going to have to posit a certain brute fact, or a set of brute facts. These things just exist in this fashion.
Right.
And I'm going to have to posit a certain brute fact or a certain set of brute facts ontologically. These things just have no further explanation. God just is self-causing and exists in such and such a way, or the universe just does exist for whatever weird reason.
Right.
Explanatorily, there are two ways we can go about this, and this gets us back to the very beginning of the video. There are reasons to think it is problematic, that it is unlikely that the universe could have brought itself into existence as matter, bringing itself into existence.
Remember, when I say ontological brute fact, I'm saying it did not bring itself into existence. It's existed forever, eternally,
so,
whatever.
Into existence as we know it. We have some sort of singularity that let's suppose, we don't necessarily know what it looks like. Let's suppose that maybe, likely or not, it is physically possible for the singularity to exist, and it's not technically coming out of nothing, it's coming out of something. That's a hypothesis. The question is whether that itself is terribly likely or not. Then we also have to ask, which is more likely, given that no God exists? Would it have then popped into existence, or popped out as and giving us things as we know them now, or would it have simply stayed a singularity, or whatever that thing was? You gotta understand, if there is no God, there's an awful lot of alternatives that could have happened that would probably be a lot more likely, and these include nothing at all existing, things existing in different ways. The question is why things came to exist as they do now, and how exactly it was that they were even able to come to exist. It's not immediately clear that these things would have been able to come to exist as we have them now without any sort of divine cause. But if there is a God who exists, it is quite plausible, quite likely that he would have been able to bring things into existence just by the nature of the sort of creator that he would be.
So the problem with your argument here is that there are two possibilities, not a singularity. Singularity, just get rid of the singularity, get rid of physics. No one cares. The two possibilities are there is a natural universe that exists eternally, necessarily, outside of space-time as the grounds of everything, a necessary natural universe, or there is a necessary supernatural God being. Both of these things can explain the universe completely in every possible way. And so both of these things are going to have a particular nature, which is a brute fact. Now, which one is simpler? It's the nature one is simpler. That's the point. So,
not like you can insist on that dogmatically all day long.
Well, no, I don't want to insist it dogmatically. I'm saying any argument you apply to be problems with the universe is going to be a problem with God, but much worse. So when you say there are lots of different ways the universe could be, like maybe nothing could exist, maybe there's a lot of different properties that could exist or whatever, there's infinitely many ways a God could be. Like maybe it's an evil God, maybe it's a God who doesn't like chickens, maybe it's a God who only wants black holes. There's infinitely many ways God could be. And your solution to this is just say, nope, God has this necessary brute fact of a nature. I
All
can
right.
just do the same thing and
So
say there is
here's why.
only
Here's where
almost
it
done.
matters that
One
we
sentence.
say.
One sentence. So I can just do the same thing and say the nature of the universe is a necessary brute fact and it couldn't be otherwise. Just assert that, just like you do for a God.
Hmm.
All right, go
So
ahead.
here's where we need to say that. Here's where it matters that we say God is omnipotent, omniscient, all good, all of these omnis, right? The reason for this is that if we're going to say God is, if we're going to allow on the table, a pantheon of gods or a bunch of demigods or gods that are only finitely powerful, well, then yes, we do have a problem. Why does this God only have this amount of power and not this amount of power? Why do we have this number of gods and not this amount of gods? But when we put on the table the existence of a God who is omnipotent, all powerful, there's only so many different ways in which this God could have turned out to exist. There's only so many different
No,
ways we could ask, why did God turn out to exist in this way and not in this way?
no, that's false. So you can just say, I can just grant all your omnis, all good, all powerful, all knowing, whatever. I can say, okay, there's a God who likes chipmunks, or a God who only wants black holes, or a God who only wants blah, blah, blah. There's still infinitely many variations of a God there. Again, so just asserting that there's only one
That's not
possible
infinitely
God.
many variations of a God. That's infinitely many variations of what God chooses to do upon existing. There's a really critical difference there.
No, I'm not saying choosing here. I'm saying it's his nature to do this. There's no choice. There's no choice involved at all. So God would, this God prefers black holes. This God prefers whatever. There's infinitely many possible variations of what God could be, his nature. Maybe all good means killing everybody. Maybe that's what he thinks all good is. So maybe all good involves making lots of cheesecake in the universe, and that's what all good is. All of these properties of these omnis are totally arbitrary. There's infinitely many variations of every single one of them. Just saying he has the epitome of morality gets you nothing. It does not tell you that this is the one possible God. It tells you we're going to define this which we like as the one possible God. And I can just do the same thing and define a God who likes to kill everyone as the greatest moral being, which is moral perfection. Like, so the problem here is that you haven't eliminated any of the possibilities. There are still infinitely many possible gods, just like there are infinitely many possible universes, and you just have to ad hoc assert this is the one only way God could be. And I can just do the same thing for the universe and say, well, this is the only way the universe could be. And I can just say, well, oh, it's because it's the omniperfect universe. Does that give us anything? Well, no, it's just obviously just an asserted thing that whatever makes this universe the way it is just the perfect, the pinnacle property of omni whatever. And that's essentially what you're doing with God. You're saying, well, this omnibenevolent feature, well, it's exactly what our God is, conveniently enough. Again, we can just say that same property of omnibenevolence indicates just a different God. And that, or a different one, or a different one, or a different one, or a different one. So there's infinitely many variations of what God could be like, just like there's infinitely many variations of what the universe could be like. Just asserting that this is the one way is the right way doesn't work. We can do that with the universe too.
All right, so you're conflating a couple of really critical probabilities here. We're not asking what is the probability that the universe would exist uh, in this particular way if God did in fact exist, as opposed to any other particular way if God existed. We're saying what is the probability that this university would exist at all in this way?
Well, no,
If God
apologize,
existed, as
apologize.
opposed to,
Really
see,
sorry.
no,
I'm
no,
really
no,
sorry.
stop,
I don't know. This
stop,
isn't about the
stop.
universe. This isn't about.
Tom,
No,
stop,
no, no,
stop,
no.
stop, stop, stop. Tom, stop. I
This
will
isn't.
leave right now if
I
you keep
know.
this
I'm
up.
sorry.
I will
I'm
leave right
sorry.
now if you keep this
I'm
up.
sorry. I
Stop.
want to
We're
just.
asking what is the
No,
probability of E
no, we're
given
not.
H versus
No,
what
we're
is the
not.
probability
No,
of
we're
E
not.
given
No, we're
not
not.
H.
That's the
Then
problem.
what are
This
you
isn't about the
doing?
universe. What is the probability of that God existing as opposed to a different God? That's the question.
That okay. So you're asking what is, yeah, John, that's exactly what I'm getting at. What is the probability of E given H versus what is the probability of E given not H? We're not asking what is the probability of H1 given E, or what is the probability of H2 given E, or what is the probability of H3 given E. Those are different questions which you're conflating with one another. We're saying what is the probability of E given H, and what is the probability of E given not H? That's what we're focusing on right now.
Well, right. So what I'm saying is just like there are infinitely many ways the universe could be. That's the I think that's the E in this analogy.
Yeah.
So, and I'm saying, well, no, that probability that you're assessing that we're trying to explain That same problem exists when you just assert there's this God. Because this God, you have to say, well, okay, so that's the E. What is the probability of that given the fact that this, whatever properties you want to ascribe to it, that could be H. What is the probability that that particular definition of a God is the right one as opposed to all the other ones? So this problem that you're trying to solve by appealing to a God and explaining why is this the fine-tuning constants E, what is the probability of E given that this God exists? Well, you can apply that exact same problem to the God. What is the probability of this God existing given?
Yeah, so you're gesturing at a question that I'm not even trying to address yet. I'm not trying to address which God exists. I'm just saying that it is more likely that a God exists, and it is more likely that a God exists with such and such set of characteristics.
Right. What I'm saying is that that's the same problem. That when your solution to that problem, I can do that same thing to the solution to the universe and get rid of all of those infinitely many possible universes and solve the problem. So there's no longer a problem of fine tuning here. There's just
in order to do that, you need to conflate E given H as opposed to H given E, and that doesn't work.
No. So I'm taking your solution to this problem and applying the same solution from a naturalistic hypothesis. So I can say, if you want to say there is this one God of this one particular nature which created the universe, I can just say there's this one universe of this one particular nature.
Yeah, I have a really, really questionable connection right now.
Yeah, I saw that. So just like you can say there is this one God of this one particular nature who created the universe, I can just skip all of that and say there's this one universe of this one particular nature. So your same solution to this problem, I can apply it to the universe on its own, get rid of the God and get an equally or better solution. So I'm taking your same answer and just applying it to the universe itself.
Okay, so run that by me one more time.
So you're saying that there is this one particular God of this one particular nature out of the infinitely many possible spectrums, just like I'm saying there's this one particular universe out of the infinitely many possible spectrums. And you're saying that this God exists as a necessary or brute fact. I can just say the universe as it is its nature, is a necessary brute fact. We're doing the same thing. Yours just has an extra feature of a God, and mine doesn't have that feature. So mine is a simpler explanation.
Right, and because mine has the extra feature of a God, I'm saying that, and we'll call this extra feature H. E given H is more likely than E given not H, because on E given not H, you get all kinds of things, including E not existing, E existing but looking very different, E existing in any number of cases.
Right, but that same problem applies to your God, because I can say that just like there's a number of variations of your God that could exist, and you now have that same problem of why does this particular God exist as opposed to the alternatives. So that same problem that you're trying to apply to the universe also applies to your God. And your
Right,
solution,
but then you're conflating H given E.
No. You
as opposed
are
to H given not E.
Again, I'm taking your solution and applying it to the universe. So any problem with this argument is a problem of your argument, not mine. So your solution to this argument is that there is a God of a particular nature, and that is a necessary brute fact. I can just take that answer and apply it to your problem of the universe, what is the probability of E given H. I can say that, well, no, that's not an issue because the way the universe is just a necessary brute fact. Just like you think the way God is a necessary brute fact, I can just say the universe is a necessary brute fact. So this problem just goes away. It's not a problem anymore. Just like you try to solve it for a God, I can do the same thing and solve it for the universe, giving us an equivalently good or bad explanation, whichever one you want, for both worldviews. It's the same answer because so they're equally good or bad.
So here's the problem. We're forming a partition here. We're saying what is the probability of E given H, where H is omniscient, omnipotent, et cetera, as opposed to not H, where this thing does not exist. This thing does not exist. It is not omniscient, omnipotent, whatever. This is a partition that is jointly exhaustive, mutually exclusive. E is more likely given H is my claim than E is given not H. So we at least have some evidence, however little, some evidence given E for the existence of God if this argument works. In order to ask the question which you want to ask, you would have to ask what is the probability of H given E as opposed to not H given E. In this case, where not H includes all of the other possible different iterations of God, where God is, evil, not all-powerful, not all-knowing, et cetera, et cetera. And then we have a different question. We have a different set of probabilities that we have to work out. That's almost more of a theological question when we phrase the probability that way. It's more of a
but I'm not answering.
theological, more philosophical question.
Right, but I'm
So
not.
right now, all I'm saying is E given H is more likely than E given not H. Therefore, E is at least some evidence for the existence of God.
Right,
For
and
H.
I'm objecting to that. I'm saying that no, it's not. The probability of the universe just existing as a brute fact is a better explanation than saying there's a God that explains the universe. I can just say there is no explanation of the universe. The universe is just the necessary thing, or I can say the universe is the God, or essentially just has no consciousness, so it wouldn't be a classical God. And so that explanation is a better explanation than saying there is a H God that exists. Now, my argument wasn't about explaining the universe. So taking your probability, it's not saying what is the probability of H given E. That's not the explanation. My probability is just taking the God and saying, just like the universe has a variation of possibilities, the God has a variation of possibilities. So I'm not explaining the universe in this argument at all. This is not even H. This is saying...
So you're asking what is the probability of H?
Yes, what is the probability of H? Just like you're saying, what is the probability of the universe being this particular way? What is the probability of the God being this particular way? And your answer to that problem, I'm going to steal and use it and just say that answer I can use to say that's the same answer for why is the universe this way.
Right. If I was making, we need to make another distinction here. And this is one that Swinburne does make. We have C inductive arguments and P inductive arguments. C inductive arguments are ones where I'm trying to say, I have this evidence and this evidence makes this hypothesis more likely than it would have been without the evidence. A P inductive argument is one where I'm saying, I have this evidence, I have this argument, and based on this induction, this hypothesis is greater than 0.5. This evidence gets us to the probability of the hypothesis,
about 50.
Being greater than 0.5, being greater than 50%, whatever. So I'm making a C inductive claim here. So we don't need to factor in the prior probability of H existing. All I'm saying is that the existence of the universe, and we're going to need to get to some points that you just raised in a second here, the existence of the universe is at least some evidence for H, such that H is relatively more likely than it would have been without E. And so your claim is that, well, E is still more likely given not H because we can just posit the universe itself and all of its characteristics as brute facts. But that's exactly the problem. Why does it exist in such and such a way as opposed to nothing existing at all? How exactly is it that it was able to come into existence? We have possible explanations. What is the probability that those explanations themselves are true? What is the actual probability that such and such a physicist actually has the correct explanation? That probability is going to need to be factored in here in order to get at a good estimation of E given not H. Those probabilities are going to compound, and the overall answer here is that the best explanation of all the empirical data is that the simplest one is just that there is a God who caused things to exist at the Big Bang.
Well, let's go with those two, your C inductive argument versus P inductive argument. You're making a C inductive argument for the universe, saying that, well, there's a big spectrum of possibilities for the universe, so we need to try and make some kind of probabilistic claim of how to explain this. Now, I can do the same thing for a God. I'm going to make a C inductive argument for your God. Well, there's infinitely many ways a God could be, and you're claiming that there is, and I'm going to say that the best way to explain that is some blah, 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 pre-God thing, a super God or whatever. And you're going to say, no. You see, God doesn't have an explanation. There are not an infinitely many variations of the way God could be because God is a brute fact or a necessary fact. So you have solved the C inductive argument with a P inductive argument. And you're saying, well, it's not an issue. There isn't this infinitely many span of the way gods could be because there is a particular thing that is, there is a P inductive argument for the way God is. Now I'm going to do the same.
Not going to be my course of action at all.
Okay. So I'm saying there's a C inductive argument. There's infinitely many ways God could be, including no consciousness. It's a pantheism, eternal, all-powerful nature, no consciousness. Now you're going to have to, the same argument, the same C inductive argument of there is a span of possibilities, and you have to explain why one over the others. Whatever solution you use to that, I can just use the same solution to the C inductive argument for the way the universe is. And so there is no problem. So any solution you apply to try and get what nature God is, I can just apply that to the universe to say this is the way the universe is, and get rid of the
C inductive argument because you're just saying that the prior probability of H is low because of all of these alternatives to H, H1 through Hn, however high that number is. I can say, well, here are reasons why that prior probability is overcome, or here are reasons why we can have some reason to think that H is more likely than H1 through Hn, however many there are. You're not making a C-inductive argument. You're not making a C-inductive argument based on any particular evidence. You're not saying that E, given E being something besides the universe, besides something that we've been applying E to, some random piece of evidence E. You're not saying that E is more likely given H1 through Hn as opposed to given just H. You're just saying H, we have all these other possibilities that we need to be able to decide why do we think it's this particular one rather than these.
No, so I'm making the same argument you are. I'm saying that the way the universe is, there's going to be particular kinds of evidence that indicates one way the particular universe is going to be. Just like you claim that there's particular kinds of evidence to indicate there's one way that God is going to be. So whatever arguments you use to try and say that there's one particular God, way God is, as opposed to all the alternatives, I'm going to be able to use that same evidence, essentially, to show that there's going to be one way the universe is going to be, as opposed to all the other ways it's going to be.
No, because now you're conflating the issue of explaining why the universe is one way rather than another, as opposed to showing that the universe is one way rather than another based on evidence.
What
That's a different question.
What?
I can use evidence to show that such and such equations describe the universe and the universe behaves in such and such a way that in fact is the case. That doesn't necessarily explain why that's the case or how that came to be.
Right.
I can give you evidence that the universe is such and such a way that is more likely given H than given our connection. Are you still with me?
Yeah, I'm here.
We're still good?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
I'm not following your argument.
And so on H, there's nothing where you're saying, with your argument, there's nothing where you're saying, well, given E, not H is more likely than H. You're just saying there's all these alternatives to H that we need to rule out, and that's fine. That's akin to saying the universe it just is a certain way, or that's the universe is a certain way based on this evidence. This is the one we're living in. I can do the same thing with different potential arguments and routes and say, well, this seems to be the God that is more likely to exist than all these other gods.
Well, I'm using all I'm doing is
that's a different thing from saying that based on such and such evidence, this God is more likely than this God to exist.
Right. So all I'm doing is I'm taking your arguments. None of these are my arguments. I'm just taking your own arguments and applying them back on.
That's not true. You don't seem to understand them properly.
No, I totally understand them. I don't think I think you're missing the point. So there's one universe the way it is. There's one God the way it is. Assume these two things exist, and there's infinitely many ways either of those could be. And so your argument is that, well, the universe has one particular nature out of many, and that needs an explanation. And I'm going to say the same thing for a God. God has one particular nature out of many, and that needs an explanation. Now, your solution is to say, here are these arguments that explain why God has this particular nature. Now, I'm going to take those same arguments because I think they're terrible, bad arguments that can be used for anything because they're just awful. And I'm going to use those same arguments to say, well, this particular way the universe is, for those same reasons, is this particular way.
All right, Tom, I'm going to start using the same rhetoric you do. And atheists can use this particular thing, which is just awful and makes no sense. And they can also use this particular thing, which makes no sense and is just awful. Come on, let's be fair in our rhetoric here. Let's be charitable.
I'm just trying to.
We're better than most internet forums, I hope.
Right, but I'm trying to convey the point of the arguments you're using to justify that this God has this particular nature can be used for the universe too. We can say this universe has this particular nature for whatever the same arguments or reasons. So the problem with your line of argumentation is that you're saying there is this object X which has this particular nature as opposed to all these others, and that needs an explanation. If that needs an explanation, so does God. Because God is one particular way as opposed to all the other particular ways. So you need an explanation for God for the same reason.
The claim here is a comparative one. It is better to take this particular God existing in such and such a way as a brute fact than to take the universe existing in such and such a way as a brute fact.
Bingo. Yes, exactly. But my contention is that that's not the case. It's simpler to take the universe.
Yes, and that's the point I wanted to get back to a long time ago.
Okay.
And so here's why that's the case. The universe has all kinds of laws that could have been different. It could have not existed in the first place. It's not entirely clear that it would have been possible for whatever mechanism that caused it to expand in the first place actually happened. Whatever hypothesis we currently have to explain that, it's not clear that that is the actual hypothesis or that was even capable. Physically capable of accomplishing what we hope for it to be able to accomplish physically. There are all of these probabilities that make it more likely that the fact of a complex universe's existence is just more likely given the existence of a relatively simple God. Not necessarily structurally simple. I would rather try to come up with an account of quantum mechanics than omnipotence. But in terms of explanatory simplicity, I need to posit fewer unexplained things to say that God exists in such and such a way than to say that the universe just exists in such and such a way and was able to come into existence in such and such a way, even though that's not necessarily immediately obviously true.
So I would just take everything you just said and apply it to a God. So all of the different variations of the way the universe could be and why it's so complex and why did it have this particular nature as opposed to the other ones. There's infinitely more ways the God could be. You don't need all of those omni properties. You can have different combinations of them. You don't have consciousness. You don't have any kind of personality or personhood or whatever, an interaction. You don't have a desire for relationship. You don't need omnibenevolent. You could just have all powerful and eternal. You could have a deistic God, a fideistic God. There are infinitely more ways the God could be than there are the ways the universe could be. So saying that you explain the way the universe is with a bigger thing that has even less probability of being true makes the explanation worse, not better.
Again, this is C inductive. If it were P inductive, if it was a P inductive claim I was making, I would have to worry about showing why all of these other possible gods aren't the gods that I think exist. I'm making a C inductive claim. It is more likely that the universe exists given this particular god's existence. This is a better explanation. This is a simpler explanation than saying all of these things just happen to exist in such and such a way without any particular explanation.
Right.
And without it being particularly clear that was even physically possible to begin with.
Right. I'm trying to refute that argument by saying that if I roll a dice, it's a deductive proof just by probability. So if I roll a dice with
deductive
six
proofs
sides,
are not necessarily good arguments. We can come up with all kinds of ridiculous deductive proofs.
If I roll a dice with 6 sides and it lands a 6, and we say, well, we need to explain why that happened as opposed to all the other ones. And you say, well, I roll a 20-sided dice and it lands a 20. That doesn't help explain the 6. That's worse. That's a worse probability. Your explanation is now worse than just saying the 6 just happened by brute fact.
So we could go into why that's not analogous, or we could start to think about ending the conversation, because we've been going at this in circles for a while now.
Well, yeah, but that's the argument I'm making, is that there are more variations of your God. Your God is the 20-sided dice, and just saying the universe landed a 6 by a brute fact is a better explanation than saying your God landed a 20 by a brute fact. The variations of your God is a worse explanation infinitely than just saying the universe just is the way it is.
Right, and you're still conflating E given H as opposed to H given E. It is more likely that you roll a 6 given 6-sided dice than that you roll a 6 given 20-sided dice. But that is a different question from asking, what is the probability that I have this 20-sided dice given that I rolled a 6, versus what is the probability that I have the 6-sided dice given that I rolled a 6? Those are very different questions that will require very different sets of explanations and routes of argumentation.
Well, that's not my argument at all. My argument is just saying that is just a reflection on your argument. So there's no explanatory here thing at all. I'm just saying, so we have a 6. We know we rolled a 6. And you're saying there's the explanation for this 6 is this 20-sided dice. Well, I'm saying, wait a minute. But then we need an explanation for the 20-sided dice.
That's not what I'm saying at all. And the reason for that is because...
No, that's what I'm saying.
Look, we have to posit, 5 properties about God that could all have been different.
No.
There are how many sets of physical laws about the universe that all could have been different, that could have existed on any number of numerical spectrums. We have to take into account the possibility that the universe didn't even exist in the first place. And then there's also the possibility that we don't actually have a good physical account of how it's even possible for the universe to come to exist, given the Big Bang, given that there is no God. All of those things... God is a better, simpler explanation than resorting to all of those other things. That's all I'm saying.
And that's what I'm saying, is that no, saying that there is an infinitely many-sided dice that has infinitely many more problems is not a better explanation than saying here's a finite number of problems. You have to assert more things are just brute fact and true in the God case than you do for the universe. Like all of the different things we have to assert about the universe, it not existing isn't a possibility.
If my claim was P inductive, you'd have a point, but
it has nothing to do with the P inductive.
You're completely missing out of this.
Is irrelevant. Again, so I'm just reflecting your own argument back at you. So
that's not how the probability works. But maybe this is just where we should call it a day.
That's not the point of the argument. So the point of the argument is that the variations, your God is not simpler explanation. it is infinitely many more complex. It's like saying there is a universe with 10 constants. Why is this happening? Well, because of a universe with a billion constants. No, that makes less sense. Now you have to explain all of those billion constants. And your
It's
God,
not even meaningfully analogous.
but that's the point, is that's the
It's
analogy
not
at all.
meaningfully
Is your
analogous.
God
That's
being,
not an analogy.
it is, because
But we're going to keep talking in circles, so we might as well just call it a day at
well,
this
yeah,
point.
so your 5 properties of a God are infinitely many properties that you all have to explain. Like, none of those are simple. None of those have anything to do with simplicity. They're the opposite of simplicity. Asserting an all-powerful
Explanatory
thing.
simplicity, we've gone over this.
Right,
Okay,
and I've already
Tom,
proven
I
why
think we
that
should call it a
never
day.
ever works. So Plantinga's and Swinburne's definitions of simplicity as applied to the God are complete crap. They're not simple. If anything is omnipotent, you've lost the argument, essentially.
Well, as much as I don't like appeals to authority, I will take Swinburne's word on this over TJump's, frankly.
I'm fine with that. I can just take basic understanding of probability and simplicity, like infinitely many
Well, you've been
properties.
displaying a complete lack of grasp of probability this entire time. So again, we should call this a day.
Yeah, we probably should, because no, your explanation has nothing to do with my argument. I mean, it's a pretty simple argument. I mean, everybody in the chat's getting it pretty simply, and most philosophers I talk
Yes,
to actually do.
and if I had a chat pulled up of mostly theists, they'd say I was winning. That's the problem with these internet debates,
Well, no,
is
no,
we
no.
will
I
all go
mean,
back to our echo chambers
I've
and say,
explained
"Oh,
this.
my guy won
Well, no,
so well."
my point is that I've explained this same argument to professional philosophers repeatedly, and they specifically say, yes, that does make sense. Yes, your explanation makes perfect sense there. You can look at my recordings with the professional philosophers where I do say this exact thing, and it's like, oh yeah, that is not a good explanation to say there's an all-powerful being, which is simple. So my explanation does make perfect sense to professional philosophers here. It's not just the people
And there
in
are
the chat.
professional philosophers to whom mine makes sense. Like, we can count noses all day here. We can have an intellectual pissing contest all day. At the end of the day, I think, especially once we're at this point of the conversation, it's a good time to call it a day.
Yeah, sounds fine to me. All right. Thanks for coming on. Interesting conversation. Talk to you later.
All right.